Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, we're going to be exploring how to use colored pencils and gouache to make a beautiful mixed media art journaling project. So let's get started. So let's talk about the surface I'll be using today. I'm using a page of Bristol paper on my Bristol board journal. I will actually add this back into my journal afterwards. If you're just working in a journal, just do this in a journal. The only reason I pulled this one out was so that I could tape it down and have my little bit of a frame around my piece of paper. One thing you may notice is that my masking tape looks a little grungy, and that's actually on purpose. I learned a new trick, which is if you take a piece of masking tape and you put it against clothing or something else to de-tack it a little bit, it won't rip the edges of your paper. Most masking tape is fairly low tack, but I find that it still manages to rip my Bristol paper. So this is something I'm going to give a try to this week to see if it works, as I'm hoping it will. So to start with, we're going to add some squares onto our piece of paper. So what I'm looking to do is create 1-inch square grid across this entire piece of paper. So you should be able to see my grid on this page. It is fairly faint. My intention was to use a 6H pencil. I wanted a very light graphite just so that I don't have to erase lines later. So to start with the first layer in our background, we're going to start by adding some colored pencil to these squares. So when you're actually adding pencil into these squares, my intention is to leave a little bit of a space between each of the squares. So you can kind of make the decision whether or not you want to have the squares, some squares bigger, some squares smaller, or if you want to try to keep them on either side of that white graphite line and erase it later. It's really up to you. And so I'm just coloring these in. You can decide how deep you want to color these. You can color them very light, you can color them very dark. It's up to you. I'm actually going to be adding a layer of acrylic paint over it to kind of give everything the same feel. But I generally like to do these fairly dark. And one thing about colored pencils is that you usually need to go more than one way just to get the pencil crayon into the fibers of the paper. The Bristol board is fairly smooth, so you don't have to work nearly as hard as you do with some other papers. But it's something to be aware of going over it more than once if you don't want those little pieces of white fibers showing through. Another way for getting a more consistent look to these squares is using a blender pencil. What a blender pencil does is it basically is like a clear pencil that you put over top, and it just gives everything a lot more consistent look. And so I'm going to come in with my next color, going to leave my little gap. And this is where maybe I should have taped down my paper, because now I have I'm not able to rotate the paper the way I wanted to, which makes this a little bit easier. And eventually I'm going to be covering all of my pencil work with a light layer of acrylic. So you can make a choice. You could, if you didn't want to do a light layer of acrylic, you could just do these in very pastel colors instead. But I like actually going in and adding some additional layers to this. So I'm actually going to be going a little bit deeper with these, just so that I end up getting a consistent deep color to these squares. And this will take a little bit of time, but I don't mind the time that it takes. I really like the idea of sometimes, as part of my self-care, not having something that I can complete really quickly. I know last week I did a project where things can be completed in about 15 minutes. And that sometimes you want those moments of quick projects, a little feeling of instant gratification. But I think sometimes it's also nice to have something you kind of pick away at, like this, where it might take you a while just to color all your squares in. But then once you've colored all your squares in, you really have something that is really beautiful and unique. And there's something to be said about that. And actually I didn't go in with my blender pen, so I'm going to go back in. And you can see that by doing that, it just kind of makes all the color blend a little bit smoother and nicer together. One thing to be aware of is make sure you are not using any sort of water-soluble colored pencil at this point in the game. The first time I ever tried this technique, I had unfortunately mixed up some of my watercolor pencils with some of my regular colored pencils, and because of that I ended up with a bit of a mess when I had paint on top. Everything bled. It was not the result I was looking for. So something to think about. You can always check your pencils. A lot of them will actually have a drop of water or some sort of brush on it, showing that it is water soluble. So something to think about when you're doing this. Just make sure you know what product you're using and what you're planning on using it for before you end up making a mistake that might ruin your piece. So you just want to continue and do this with all the squares, and I'm just going to kind of pop ahead and show you what this will look like when it's fully done. So now that you've added all of your pencil crayon, and you'll notice I've tried to leave where I can the little white spots in between each of the boxes just to give it a little bit more definition. The next thing you want to do is add a little bit of gesso. In this case, I am using some Liquitex gesso. You could use white paint, but I would suggest using gesso for this step because we're going to be adding other mediums on top. And what's nice about that is gesso has a lot of tooth, which allows other things to stick to it better, which is why I like using it a lot in my mixed media work. So in this case, I wet my brush and I made it quite wet and I dipped it into my gesso. You don't want the gesso to be completely white. You want it semi-transparent because the idea is that you want to start adding a little bit of muted color by adding a gentle wash. You could probably go a little bit deeper in color than I am right now. So you actually just want to add a little bit across just to give it a little bit of softer feel to these colors. The other option is, if you don't really like to add gesso on top, is you could just go lighter with all of the colors that you put down. But what I like about this is it really kind of makes everything kind of uniformly similar in kind of softness, which I think you might have a bit of trouble getting without adding paint on top. And one of my colors, I think it might be this blue, seems to be seeping a little bit of color. So something to be really aware of when you're trying to use your pencil crayons, because all these are marked as being non-water soluble, but you sometimes still get these moments of things bleeding a little bit. So we're going to let that dry completely, and then we'll move on to the next step. So you want to make sure that this is fully dry before you move on to the next step. The next thing we're going to do is actually add an image on top. You can either freehand it, but in my case, because my drawing skills, I'm still working on them, what I've done is actually take a drawing that I've done and I've actually transferred it to a piece of tracing paper. And so I'm just going to figure out where I kind of want to sit on my design here. And what I'm going to do is actually use a tracing technique that I've used in a previous video with Conte crayons to transfer the image. And if you're interested in seeing that video, I have it in the card in the corner. So for this technique, we basically just throw some Conte crayon on the back of our image. We flip it over and just trace it on. So in this case, I'm trying to follow the rule of thirds with this. And so basically I'm taking a really hard pencil. This one's a 6H pencil. And I'm just tracing my image onto my project. And when you are trying to transfer images, or even if you're learning how to draw, like with this one, I didn't really go into a lot of detail. I took some of my mountain photos and just took aspects of each of them to create the scene. And you could also use graphite instead of Conte crayon. I actually learned the Conte crayon technique from a previous art instructor that I was taking some classes from, and her comment is because the graphite can sometimes stain and not completely go away, well, the Conte crayon, you're pretty much guaranteed that you're going to have it all be removed just because of the nature of the crayon itself. And the horizon line wasn't quite as straight as I'd like, so I'm kind of adjusting that. And there you see, you can actually see the image has transferred quite well onto my surface. So now that we've transferred our image, we now need to decide what type of pen we want to outline it with. In this case, I actually have this mixed media book that I used to put all my samples in. And I actually did do a sample of all of my different black pens. And what you'll notice is anything on the right hand side here, I've actually mixed it with water to see how water soluble these pens are. I did actually do this about 12 to 24 hours after I'd put the actual pen down. So what I've noticed about a lot of pens is that some of them are really great, but they do take a while to dry before you can add wet medium on top. And that's why I'm going to be sticking today, I think, with some of the Sakura archival pigment ink pens. They're going to probably be a little bit more permanent more quickly. But I will probably run a heat gun over this before I finish, just to make sure that this is very dry before I start adding wet medium. And actually, sorry, I think I said the wrong type of pen. I'm using a Sakura Microperm, and so these are supposed to be a permanent ink. I'm also going to use the Zebra Sensations Fine Permanent pen. And some of these areas are going to be thinner and thicker, so where I can, I may want to vary my line size. I often use dip pens for this type of work, and so I'm trying to vary what I use in my projects, and this is also a lot easier and a lot faster than using a dip pen. For the mountains, I do want to make sure that they do have a nice, strong line, and that's why I'm going to be using this zebra pen because it's a little bit thicker. And it's nice because it is a brush nib, but it's a very stiff brush nib. So if you struggle a little bit with control like I do, it does help you a little bit. I think I might move down to a slightly thinner pen for these foothills. And this is why you want to make sure your paint's really dry before you do this step, because you can actually ruin the nibs of these pens. And that's why sometimes I stick with a dip pen, just because I can get away with using it on a less dry surface. I just want to try to fix that horizon line. And this is the beauty of using the Conte crayon, is you do not need to follow the lines exactly. It's very easy to erase without ruining your background. So it's one of the reasons I use it over graphite. Just trying to emulate the idea of trees and bushes. I'm not following my tracing that I did before exactly. I just wanted to make sure that I had my general proportions correct so that if I needed to make a change, I could. It's a little bit easier to trace than to freehand all the time, and so sometimes I'll already use something I've already painted and just take a tracing of it because it does save me a little bit of time. And I think I'm going to go back to my zebra marker just to go in behind this guy. So now, if we want to remove the rest of the Conte crayon, it's very easy. You take your kneadable eraser, you roll it like so, and you just come across your surface with it. And it takes off most of the Conte crayon, which is a little bit easier than going in with an eraser and having to remove graphite. I also find this is a bit gentler on my pen marks, so I don't lose a lot of the great black consistency of it. And if you see spots like here that are on a little bit more, you can just rub it. And in this case, it's still sitting there a little bit, but that's okay because we're going to be adding color on top, and so you're not even going to be able to notice it. But I do want to remove as much of the Conte crayon as I can. Just try to clean up my drawing a little bit. So for this particular painting, I'm using gouache. And what gouache is basically opaque watercolor. I like using it in some projects when I want something that's a little bit darker or a little bit more vibrant than watercolor, but I don't necessarily want to use acrylic. And so this is a little bit of leftover gouache that I had from a previous project. I often also pull it just straight out of the tube and use it in my projects depending on what I'm doing. So It's a little bit nicer straight out of the tube, but it works really well in the pan form as well. And then this way, I usually just put out a little bit, use what I have, and then if I need to have some fresh paint, then that's great too. But I just realized that I forgot to put in some clouds in my sky, so I'm going to go in quickly and freehand a few clouds. So now what you want to do is go in and start adding color to your clouds and to your sky. So I'm going to start with a little bit of the gray I already have out on the palette. And basically how I mixed this gray was basically using a little bit of the black and a little bit of the white that I had. And I want to make it that the bottom of my clouds is a little bit of a darker gray. And actually, I'm going to grab some straight from the palette. I think I have actually watered down my gouache a little bit too much. It's getting more of a watercolor look. The look that I want. And one thing you can do is if you find that you either don't like where your lines are or you want them thicker, you can always come in after and just add a little bit more thickness. In this case, I'm coming in with a little bit of black just to try to make the bottom of those clouds a bit darker. So clouds have those shades to them, so I'm just going to try to emulate that a little bit in this drawing. And just to show you, I'm actually using this whole bean gouache. It comes in these little tubes, and these little tubes, they might seem really small, but they go a long way. In this case, I want to put a little bit of just straight white out on my palette. This is going to allow me to get a little bit of white in my clouds. I try to not always use white a lot. I know more purist watercolorists are like, well, you never use white, but I will, just because sometimes in this case where maybe I haven't shown as much control in my painting, this is a way I can kind of correct some of my mistakes. So I think the idea is that if you can learn the control so that you don't need a ton of white, that's great. I think the other thing too is because we are actually, I'm just going to move to a slightly thinner paintbrush. I'm going to use a size 0 for this actually. Actually, I'm going to move to size 2. I don't need to go that small. Because we're actually painting on top of acrylic, because we do want to try to have these clouds stick out, we're going to be adding white just so that it does pop a bit from the background. So the whole idea with this project is not to completely cover up what we've done underneath. It's a lot of things to peek on through. I have really embraced the idea of underpainting a lot in my work. I love the ideas of having things peeking through and just having things that you kind of go, oh, I think I see something there that I didn't realize was there. And that's something that can be really beautiful, and those little surprises in your personal art. And I think it just adds a lot of variety and creativity to your work. Because again, you can see there's some places there where I've had the white, but the little bits of green are showing through, and that's very much on purpose. So I'm going to go in with this kind of whitey gray color. Again, they do work very similarly to watercolor because they are a watercolor, just a lot more opaque, and I believe they're built a little bit differently. It's going to go in with a tiny bit of white along the top there. just try to add a little bit of highlight. Okay, now let's move on to our mountains. This is the thing about gouache I find, is that once you leave it in the pan for a while, it gets a little bit, kind of falls apart into these almost little bits of color, which can be good or bad. I'm actually gonna take a second and just clean my palette off. I'm finding this isn't totally working according to plan because a lot of the area that I'm mixing already has a bunch of color in it. So give me 1 second. Okay, that's a bit better. In this case, I'm going to put a little bit of purple and a little bit of blue, because I do want this to be fairly opaque, and I may have added a little bit of too much water to my leftover gouache, which sometimes can cause little problems like this. So that's better. And so I like the idea that these mountains here are kind of in shadow, which is why they're being done in purple. So you know, when you look at the mountains themselves, they're not all perfectly in light. In this case, I'm going to add some blue in there. This bottom areas are going to be a little bit darker. To a slightly smaller paintbrush. In this case, I went a little bit far with that, so I don't want it completely black in there, so you can always just take a little bit of the paint off, roll it on your piece of paper towel. And that's how you can easily remove color when you've taken things a little too far. So in this case, I'm going to just take a little bit of the black, mix it with the blue here. There you go, that's the color I'm looking for. Take a little bit of the purple, mix it with the blue. Move back to the slightly larger paintbrush, because the larger paintbrushes hold a little bit more water, which works I find a little bit better for this type of work. But I think that the key is trying not to overdo it with the water so that it buckles and bleeds everywhere. So it's a really happy medium that you have to figure out kind of as you paint. And the more you paint, the easier it gets. And we're also working on gesso. Gesso is not that easy to work off of, not compared to watercolor paper or something like that. So again, you're going to it's not going to work as nicely. And say if you're new to watercolor, try to stick with watercolor paper where you can. You're going to find that you're going to be a lot happier with the result that you're getting. So just going to try to pull this down a little bit, add a little bit of water to pull this down. adding in a little bit of the blue. So you can see that in some areas I'm actually making it quite dark, in other areas I'm making it a little bit lighter. The whole point is to try to add a little bit of variation to what's going on. And now I'm going to move on to add in the mountains and behind. And this is the idea, is I was looking for trying to create a sense of areas that are going to be in the foreground, maybe a bit darker, and then things that are going to be in light and are going to be lighter. You can see that gouache, after you leave it a while, does get a little bit grainy. You got to work it a little bit to get it a little bit smoother again. And so this is where I generally try not to fill an entire pan full of gouache. I try to work on it a little bit at a time, so I can usually work with a little bit of fresh paint as well. Actually, I'm going to add a little bit of blue, not black, to my green paint to make it darker. Black is actually not usually the best color to use to darken your paints. And this is where it takes a little bit of color theory and getting to know your color wheel a little bit of like figuring out which color of red, green, or blue you want to add instead of always moving straight to black, because black can overpower and can kind of muddy stuff a little bit if you're not careful. You want to be very careful when you do this. You want to make sure that, I notice that most of the gouache close to the edge is dry. So that's the only reason I'm doing this. Otherwise, I'd make sure the stuff is fully dried before trying to add more color, because otherwise it ends up bleeding into each other quite easily. And this is where you can take advantage of some of these lighter squares in here, just to allow it to let some of that lighter color seep on through, and that can add a lot of variety to your painting. And this is, again, some play. So if you like a lot of color, or you like not having a lot of color shining through, that's really a personal preference. So it's figuring out what you like to see, what you find appealing in some of these colors. Moving back up to a bigger brush. I actually generally like using a bigger brush for spreading color where I can. And so this is the permanent green deep with a little bit of white. Again, this is always a little bit trickier when you're working on gesso over watercolor paper. I feel like you have to work it a lot more to kind of get the same result. And I love watercoloring, but I wouldn't say it's it's a work in progress. Let's leave it at that. Watercolor is so fun. I find it probably one of the most relaxing mediums, but easy, I wouldn't call it easy. It's learning to find the way where you're getting the results you want without overworking it too much. Which is my tendency is to overwork things a lot. And this is where I kind of work in areas. I try to work top to bottom, but then sometimes there's areas like this where I'm going to be adding white and gray. You don't want it to blend with your wet paint. So you need to let that dry a little bit before you move on to the next section. I'm actually going to try to grab a little of this yellow. Try to get a slightly different shade of green. Try this brighter yellow actually. Ah, there we go. It's a little different than that permanent green light, and I'm going to add a little bit more paint. Try to darken it a little bit. I'm going to come in here and just add it to, let me move to a smaller brush again. My hope is to try to contrast everything else below, because this is going to be a bit more in shadow again. So I think I may have gone a little bit bright with this, but I'm going to add the first layer and then kind of add from there. This spot is a little bit lighter than the rest, so I'm going to change it a little bit so it looks the same as everything else. I feel like I do want to try to add some black and green together to try to get some darker spots in here. Because you know how when you see a coastline from a ways away, it looks pretty dark. And when the light's kind of coming up from above, yeah, I think that's a little bit better. Oh, and this is drying pretty quickly, which is another great thing about gouache. So I'm going to start by trying to add in a little bit of white on the tops of these mountains. So again, I want a little bit of that background color to come through, but I'm actually going to be leaving this sky section just the way it is. So because I'm doing that, I don't necessarily want any of this to be the same color as this. There needs to be some variation. The mountains, they don't always start perfectly white. And I just dumped my hand in my paint and made a mess there. So this is the one thing about when you're working with watercolors. You're not working on an easel, so you got to be careful where you put your hand. But I will fix that. It's not a big issue. And that's the other thing with gouache that kind of has its appeal, is if you accidentally get your hand in something or smear something, the good thing is because it's opaque, you can fix it. You can add a little bit more opaque color on top and then you're set. And remember that the gouache will re-wet if you mix it again. So you can see that as I'm touching a little bit of the green, I'm getting a little bit of green swirls in there, and that's okay. I'm actually all right with that. But if you're not, just make sure that you clean your brush often, and you're just really kind of careful as you're doing this. So I love how in the Rockies we end up having a lot of the green kind of hitting a gray rock, and then eventually you'll see the white caps at the top of our mountains. So this is kind of what I'm trying to emulate. I'm pretty fortunate to live in a city that's not too far away from the mountains, so we actually get to take advantage of the beauty that's kind of not too far from our back door. And this isn't a particular mountain range, I just kind of put it together from a few random pictures that I had and some sketches I had done. I'm going to try to add in more of that straight white just to the tops here. And it's kind of doing a little bit of a wet on wet technique here. And I do have other videos on watercolor, more using proper watercolor paper. In this case, it's been more, I really liked wanting to use this type of mixed media technique, which is why I'm using this on top of gesso instead of using it in a little bit more of a conventional way. So you can see in these areas I've actually allowed some of the white to come through. I didn't want to completely cover the background. I want it to be a picture on top of this mixed media background, but still see the mixed media come through in some of these places, add a little bit of color to the places I've dried. And so that's very purposeful in this particular design. And again, if you don't like this look, if you want to completely cover it up or even really soften the sky and stuff like that, you can definitely go ahead and do that. It definitely is more than one way you can do a layout like this. This is basically my take on it. I like having the layers and seeing the layers come on through. I chose a really bright blue for my lake. And the reason for that being Moraine Lake, which is in Banff National Park, actually is about this color of blue. It is beautiful. It's the minerals in the water make the lake this kind of crazy, crazy blue color that you don't often see in nature. And it's a beautiful place surrounded by mountains and is definitely worth a visit if you're ever in Alberta. I spent a lot of time hiking up in this area when I was younger. I don't have a chance to get out as much anymore. It's actually very busy during the summer in that area, so it makes a little bit getting out to go hiking there a bit challenging, but it is a very stunning spot, which is why I have no problem actually using this nice solid blue, because it is in nature that actual blue color. The mountains surrounding that particular lake look nothing like this, but this is where I'm taking my own imagination and taking parts of different mountains and different things I've been seeing and kind of add them all together just to make an interesting image. And this is where you can really have fun with the gouache, going lighter and darker. You can choose to make it super dark, or you can have some of these lighter areas to allow the background color to come through. There's no rules with this. It just comes down to what you personally would like to see in your painting. I don't necessarily want it all just one color, so I'm going to take my blue and add a little bit. Yeah, so I'll take my turquoise blue, I'll take a little bit of my ultramarine deep, create a slightly deeper blue, and just add a little bit here. Because usually the further away it is, the deeper it looks. I also add a little bit of white with that turquoise blue to make it a little bit of a lighter color in front and a little bit darker in the back. I actually might want to go in with that ultramarine and just dip in a little bit of color as well. And so I've deepened it a bit, but again, you can still see those background colors coming on through, which is very much the purpose of this painting. Adding a bit more white in here, trying to get that little bit of extra contrast. adding a little bit of that extra white to the clouds. Now the spot that I accidentally ran my hand through earlier, I'm just going to fix that right in here. And if you run into stuff like that, or it dries and it's not totally the colors you want, you can always just re-wet the gouache and just add a little bit more color to it. Make that look like there's a few more bushes in front. I'm not going to necessarily pen them in, but I wanted to kind of give the illusion of that. And that's one way you can also play with your watercolor, just to add a little bit more interesting depth. So to finish off that tree, I'm just going to use just a mid-green. Again, it's a pretty scribbly tree already. I just want to try to add in a little bit of the branches, and I'm going to again add some more pen on this once I finish it. I just want to try to get a good shape going. I'm doing this quite opaque, but if you want it to show in the background color a bit more, you also can just thin your paint a little bit more. It's kind of the nice thing about gouache is you can actually go quite opaque, or you can actually lighten it up quite a bit. And I like that it re-wets just the same way as watercolor does. It acts very similar to watercolor, so if you're looking at a way to add something a little bit different to your watercolor, this is maybe a really good option for you. Add some little highlights to the tree by going with more of that permanent light green. Kind of helps it pop from that background. So I'm going to let this fully dry, and then I'm going to go back in with some pen. You want to make sure it is fully dry, because again, you could wreck your pens if you go about this too quickly. And we will add a little bit more black ink, and then we'll go from there. So I've removed the tape, and it already looks a lot better, but I'm going to go in with one of my Microperm Sakura markers, add both a 1 and a 0.3 here, just to help work on the edges a bit, just to help the black come to the front again for this picture. It's okay to lose a little bit of it, but I particularly like with this one being able to come back through again. Just fix a few edges, a few corners. I think it just gives it a cleaner look, and because we do have a lot of pattern behind this with the colored pencil background with the white paint, it's nice to be able to have this pop a little bit more. I've actually moved down to my 0.1mm pen. I think it's working a bit better for just adding the lines without adding too much heaviness. And you might notice some places like here where I didn't get quite up to the edge. It's fine to leave those just as they are. One thing I've learned from doing some urban sketching is that sometimes leaving those little spots kind of gives it a little bit more character instead of having everything look perfect all the time. And I actually might move to my 0.3 here for the mountains, just because of the fact that I did use a zebra pen on this, which is quite a bit thicker. And these colors are darker as well, so it can take a bit more pen work. Actually grabbing that zebra brush pen for a couple of these areas, because I did lose quite a bit of those dark colors when I was adding in my paint. Zebra pen's kind of fun because it is a brush tip. You add more pressure, you get a slightly thicker line. Add less pressure, you get a slightly thinner line. These ones are nice because they are fairly stiff, which makes it a little bit easier to have that more fine control. Part of the reason I enjoy using a dip pen, because you can kind of get those thin and thick lines depending on how hard you press. If you've never used a dip pen, I did do a video that was talking about dip pens and how to use them in your work. I actually have a couple projects as well that I did with the dip pen. And so the tree didn't necessarily go perfectly on the same lines. I don't mind having some extra scribbly lines in there as well. The last thing I'm going to do is add my quote. I have a small quote here: "Look deep into nature and then you will understand everything better," by Albert Einstein. I really love the idea of looking deep into nature, and maybe part of this comes down to finding so much solace in nature. I find that sometimes it's that place to breathe, to kind of take that little break. Sometimes you do understand things better just from being around nature. I'm fortunate because I'm not too far from mountains, and we have a beautiful backyard, and it's a wonderful place to spend time and just understand more about yourself and about nature. So I hope you've enjoyed this project and maybe learned something new today. Again, the colored pencils with the gouache is a little bit of a stretch for me. These are not products I usually use together, but I'm really happy with the results. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and maybe let me know about what you liked about this video, or if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. I also have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have photo instructions for each of these projects, as well as a supply list and some other things that might help you when coming up with what to do in this sort of project. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.